This program features Cynthia Enloe being interviewed by Anwar Mhajne. It was recorded on March 17th, 2021.
Welcome to the Carnegie New Leaders podcast produced by the Carnegie Councils for Ethic and International Affairs, a series where members of the CNL program identify leaders in their field and ask these experts critical questions about ethics and leadership. Our aim is to help listeners understand why ethics matter in everything from academic research to technology development and foreign affairs. So, hello and welcome to our listeners. My name is Dr. Anwar Mhajne. I'm an assistant professor at Stonehill College and a member of Carnegie New Leaders program. Today, I have the pleasure of hosting Professor Cynthia Enloe from Clark University to talk about feminism, ethics, and international affairs. Professor Enloe is an internationally renowned feminist theorist and writer. For her work on gender and militarism and her contributions to the field of feminist international relations. Her books include, among others, Maneuvers, the International Politics of Militarizing Women's Lives, Nemo's War, Emma's War, Making Feminist Sense of the Iraq War, and Seriously, Investigating Crashes and Crises as if Women Mattered. In 2017, she was selected to be named on the Gender Justice Legacy Wall. That's awesome. Congrats. Installed in the International Crimes Court in The Hague. So Cynthia, I would like to begin. And I want to say that the reason I wanted to host you is because your work has been very influential in feminist thinking about international relations. I know from personal experience, your work has been very influential in the way I conduct my research, in the way I understand politics, and even in the way I understand my lived experiences as a woman from the Middle East, as a Palestinian with Israeli citizenship, and all the different layers that come with that, right? And before actually being exposed to your work and being exposed to feminism, I did not have a deep understanding of how I wasn't able to make sense of my life because I didn't have the vocabulary for it.
Yeah.
And also because I didn't know how interconnected international politics was to my, day-to-day practices and kind of day-to-day customs and the way my life was being run. And I'm saying being run because it felt like it sometimes, right? That there are forces that are bigger than us. So I think one of the books that I really found very foundational are the book was called Bananas, Beaches, and Bases, Making Feminist Sense of International Politics for Us. That was kind of assigned for me by Professor Anne Runyon. She is also another great feminist international relations scholar. And I found the book to be life-changing, as I said, as all of your work. But one of the things that I found interesting in the book is that you kind of challenge the reader to be curious about women's lives and utilize this intrigue as a means to question existing power structures by unpacking the employment and production of masculinity and femininity, as means to a very particular end. And I was wondering if you could tell us, first of all, to a general audience who's never heard of feminist curiosity, what does feminist curiosity mean? What is it? And then why is it important for our understanding of international politics?
Oh, Anwar, first of all, it is so great to be in this conversation with you. That's the most important thing of all, right?
Thank you.
So that's first. It's just great to be chatting with you and sorting things out with you and, carrying on our joint exploration, right? We're both on roads and we don't know where the roads will go. And we'll probably have to pave new ways or find new routes. But I think, when I first began to do work informed by feminist questions, I didn't use the term feminist curiosity. It came to me, to tell you the truth, it came to me and I started using it. I was giving a series of lectures. I was invited to give a series of lectures in Tokyo. And I can still see this big auditorium. It was great because it was a science auditorium. And all your listeners, if they've taken any college courses, they know that when you go into a science classroom, a big science classroom, they are laid out really differently. They are usually kind of auditorium style with steep rows. But the other thing that is great about science classrooms is that they have a lot more blackboards than most other, right? Because they have to write all their formulas 1,000 different ways. Anyway, so that was the kind of auditorium that I was giving these lectures to in Tokyo, and they were being translated, which is actually a very interesting ethics. And I'm very admiring of translators. But so I tried Anwar. This was an audience that could come from any place in Tokyo, and even some people, I guess, came from other cities. And it was about international relations and what feminist explorations of international relations could reveal. So that was the setting. And I was trying to think how I could help engage people for whom this was all very new. And you know, for any of us, when you come into something new, you just hope that the speaker will realize that you're a smart person, but you're talking about new terrain. And so I began, and I actually believe this as well, but I began using the idea of feminist curiosity because I wanted to say to everybody in the audience, you don't have to call yourself a feminist. Maybe you will, maybe, of course, I hope you will eventually, but you may, at first you may not. What really is distinctive, I think, about being a feminist and trying to make sense of international affairs, international politics, is that you ask different questions than non-feminists. You ask questions that non-feminists don't even dream of thinking are related to international politics. You know this very well. You do it with your students, I'm sure. And you get them to ask questions and they think, oh, I never thought I'd ask this in an international politics class. Oh, dear. Anyway, so that was why I used feminist curiosity, because I wanted to say to everybody who was in the audience, and some people were Japanese feminists and they were way ahead of me. So it's not like everybody was a newbie in the auditorium. A lot of people were really, really way ahead of me. Japanese feminists are great. But some of the people were quite new to the subject. And I wanted to say, here are some of the questions to ask that you probably have never imagined asking in order to make sense of international politics. So that's why curiosity, and I think it's really interesting to change your curiosity and to watch yourself. I bet everybody who's listening can think of a moment where they began to ask new questions about something, about weather, about, if they're thinking bigger, about climate, about their family, the questions that they'd never asked before, about economics, and now we're talking in the middle of this pandemic, about health, questions they'd never asked before. And it's a very exciting moment in our lives when you begin to develop a new curiosity. And that's really what I was urging people in Tokyo, but also in my teaching and writing, is ask questions you never thought you would ever need to ask in order to truly understand what is international and what is political.
And why do you think the specific feminist questions are important for understanding international politics? What kind of lens do they add to us?
Yeah, because feminists, well, first, I think one of the core distinctions of being a feminist in your intellectual life and in your social and political life is that you actually take women's diverse lives seriously. You don't lump all women together. You don't dismiss women as if they're naive or they're off stage or who cares, because except for a couple of exceptional people like Angela Merkel, you know, they don't have power in international politics. And so why pay attention? And the one of the core understandings of feminists is that women's lives are interesting, they're diverse, and you have to pay attention to them in all their diversity and all their complexity. You have to pay attention to women's lives if you're going to make sense of international politics. And that's new to most people. It's new to a lot of women, but it's really new to a lot of men. The idea that women's lives are crucial to make sense of the international garment industry, to make sense of the international politics of weapons exports and imports, to make sense of international finance, to make sense of weak states and powerful states, that you have to ask questions about women's lives. That really comes as, for a lot of people who first hear somebody asking them to do that, first of all, they say they don't know what to ask. Well, that's okay, we can start there. But the second thing is they really have a hard time convincing even themselves that it matters. Why would women matter? Women don't have power. Not very many women anyway. Women's lives are all domestic. Women's lives are close to the home. Women's lives are not interesting for the big picture of international politics. So that's where you have to start. And you have to show, you can't just argue it, you have to show it.
Yeah, thank you. That's great. And talking about militarism and feminism, WILF, the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, actually worked on a lot of agreements for arms control, disarmament, and didn't they also win? I think one part of it won the Nobel Prize for the nuclear.
ICAN.
And yes,
which is the International Campaign Against Nuclear Weapons. ICAN.
It was housed within WILF's office.
WILF is very much part of the ICAN campaign to ban nuclear weapons, and now it's gotten 50 state signatories, ratifications, and therefore it is in operation in the world. And for any of our listeners, you should be curious about whether your government has not just signed, but ratified the international treaty to ban nuclear weapons, which is supported by this broad feminist informed campaign called ICAN.
Thank you. So this is shout out to ICAN and everyone who worked really hard to make this happen.
And working hard country by country now.
Yeah. Thank you, Cynthia. So I'm going to move on to my next question. So could you define international feminist ethics of care for us? And then how can that inform more ethical policy approaches to international affairs?
Well, it's just like everything. Feminists to begin to think like a feminist or begin to want to take on board feminist ideas and feminist ways of being in the world. It transforms your ideas about everything. And I'm not a professional ethicist. That is, nobody would ask me to do an edited book on ethics. That's not who I am. I study politics. But here's what happened to my own understandings. When you become a feminist, or you just are beginning, it's not something that you all of a sudden put on a new uniform or something. But as you are beginning to absorb feminist questions and feminist values and feminist commitments, what happens to your idea of ethics is this, I think. It makes you much more curious, much more sensitive to complicity. Complicity. That is, that it's not just, oh, that person is the perpetrator of unethical behavior, right? Stealing from the till or using violence or claiming credit where it's not due. That's enough. But when you become a feminist, because when you become a feminist, you think in much more complicated ways. Feminists are not simple thinkers. Feminists have a high toleration for complexity. And what has happened to me in my own ongoing journey is that I'm now really interested in all the ways, and I look at myself as well, all the ways that I'm complicit in other people's unethical behavior or people's unethical assumptions. That is, for instance, one of the most common, this isn't just about feminism, one of the most common ways of being unethical is to use your common authority or your role to serve your own interests. It's called corruption, all right? But what feminists, I've learned, do is they say, well, who tolerated it? Is it just the person who actually put their hand in the till, if you will? Is it just the person who, developed a highway to serve their own business? They took a government contract, they built a highway, but it was mainly to serve their own interest, not the public interest for safe roads. It's to say, so who else tolerated that? Who else enabled that? Who never blew the whistle? Who turned away and paid no attention? And that, I think, is a very feminist way of thinking about ethics. It's more demanding. Becoming a feminist, you're much more demanding on yourself, aren't you? Yeah. And so, yeah, right. Being a feminist, I have to say, is a lot of fun. It makes life very exciting, but it's also demanding. And so when I think about feminist, what feminism brings to thinking about ethics is that one moves beyond the particular perpetrator, the particular unethical actor who's caught with his hand or her hand in the till. And you begin to think about, so who encouraged that? Who paid no attention to it? Who let it slide by because that person was so valuable, or that person was so famous, or that person is a person you want to ask a favor of, so you just don't look at it. And that's what is one of the things that happens. The other thing that happens when you become a feminist and you think about ethics is that you wonder, are there certain ways of, what should I say? Are there certain ways of defining what is a real man or a real boy? That's always in quotes. A real boy or a real man. Are there certain ways that a parent, an uncle, a teacher, a religious mentor, even, that a boss, that encourage a person to act unethically? That is, a real man doesn't care about that. Oh, you're just being like a girl. You're soft to worry about that consequence. And what feminists always have on their mind is the ways that boys and men are taught to be acceptable as real boys or real men in ways that makes it likely they will slide down the greasy slope into unethical behavior because it's thought to be manly. It's thought to be masculine. But the same thing is true of femininity. That is that girls and women can be encouraged by their husbands, their fathers, their mothers, their aunts, their teachers, their bosses to act in a certain way to be real women or to be a real girl that make them tolerate unethical behavior, not think they can criticize, not think that they are being loyal wives if they blow the whistle. So feminists do two things. We probably think 80 things, but right, to answer your question, the one is that we never look just at the perpetrator of unethical behavior. We ask about all the people who enable it, turn away from it and dismiss it. But then the other thing is we always ask about who teaches whom about what it means to be a real man or a real boy or a real woman or a real girl that encourages them to be an enabler, to be complicit, or in fact, to be unethical in their own behavior.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think now I'm expanding a little bit my work to include feminist perspective on, kind of to examine colonialism, imperialism from a feminist perspective, especially in the conflict, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in the Middle East, and also to look at the UN and international institutions, right, and how they instrumentalize gender. And then there's another research that has been done on instrumentalizing women's rights as a way to justify invasions and interventions, right, that could be costly for human life, right? So that's just part of the complexity of feminism and feminist analysis of and feminist ethics, right, and the view of how politics should be analyzed and who.
Yeah, because I think you're quite right, Anwar. That if you think about how does colonialism draw so many people into its inequalities and its unfairnesses around, and its sexism and its racism. How does colonialist or neo-colonialist or imperialist or neo-imperialist, how does it do that? Right?
Mhm.
And that's exactly why when you think about big structures depend on luring any of us who desire safety, reward, status, into unethical sorts of behavior.
Yeah, that's great. That's very true too. At least that's what I'm finding from my research. And again, we're experiencing that as marginalized groups are experiencing that on day-to-day basis.
Yeah, I mean, to be marginalized and to have very little power doesn't mean you don't have ethical choices to make.
Exactly.
But it's very hard to see the ethics sometimes.
Mm-hmm.
Sometimes I find that novels are particularly good, don't you? That really smart ethical writers, right? Viet Nguyen, the Vietnamese American novelist, for instance, his book called The Sympathizer, and his new book called The Committed, are so much about day-to-day micro ethical choices, which his characters oftentimes, don't act ethically. But that's part of this bigger structure. And sometimes I think, as you say, we focus on the big structures, particularly if we're not feminists. We talk about the big structures, but those big structures can only survive if lots and lots and lots of different people are lured into lack of ethical awareness and unethical behavior and enabling of unethical behavior.
Yeah, I don't know why this reminded me of money. Money is just like, it's just it's a paper, but we put so much meaning into it that it governs our lives now. And that's exactly how all institutions exist. It's because people invest so much time and energy in making them real, right? And believing in them.
Yes, it's true. But a lot of people are lured into either unethical behavior or complicity in unethical behavior, internationally and locally and personally, because they are afraid of losing status. So for instance, one of the things we've learned, and I know you know this from your studies, one of the things we've learned for a lot of women and girls, respectability is absolutely crucial. You have to be, and respectability is always in the eye of other people. It's will other people, your parents, your neighbors, your workmates, your friends, other people you don't even know in the community, will they think of you as a respectable woman? And so for a lot of women, respectability does sometimes lead to having more financial security, but not always. Sometimes you cannot take the risk, you think, of not being respectable. And for some women, in many societies, including our own, speaking out about sexual harassment, for instance, speaking out makes you not look very respectable as a woman. Women are supposed to be, in this patriarchal notion of a real woman, you're supposed to be quiet and loyal. You're
Yeah.
not supposed to attract attention.
Yeah, and I think Paul Ammar did a lot of work on respectability politics in the context of the security state. And on my research in Egypt, I kind of used his work because what he says is the state is using concepts of respectability to kind of undermine protesters. So women in protest spaces are not like your daughter or my daughter. They're just
Claim.
yeah, and that's why sexual assault is such a powerful tool to prevent women from protesting, and why it was used a lot in these protest spaces.
And to hear swear and
So I think it's a great point that you make. So I know you wrote a few articles, or you wrote one article or two for WILF on COVID and like feminist responses to COVID crisis and feminist understanding of the COVID crisis. So I was wondering if you could tell us, what could feminism tell us or inform, how could feminism inform government responses to the COVID crisis, or our understanding in general of what's happening under COVID?
Yeah, well, first of all, for your listeners, that WILP, Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, WILP, WILPF.org, and then go online to their website and then go to their COVID-19 series, and you'll see, oh gosh, Anwar, there must be 20 different feminists from around the world, right, that have written essays there, including the few I wrote. But here's what I think we've learned. And again, we've learned it collectively. Everyone's had to tell us this. And people have had to study things and follow things and report on things that they hadn't before the pandemic. I think one of the biggest revelations, it shouldn't be a revelation, it's not news, but it's news to a lot of people. Mm-hmm. And that is the importance of women's unpaid labor. Now, the World Bank, the IMF, and others have been lobbied by feminist economists and feminist development specialists and feminist sociologists for, 30 years, 40 years. You know, learning is sometimes very slow. So feminist scholars and researchers and reporters have been talking about the importance of women's unpaid labor, which usually happens in this place called the home, but the home turns out to be wherever they're caring for their children, right? Wherever they're caring for elderly relatives. The home isn't necessarily inside the front door, but we collectively have been talking about this and doing research on it and showing evidence for, I'm not kidding, 40 years at least. I remember the bumper sticker around Boston where I live in the early 1980s, maybe the late 1970s. No, 1970s. And the bumper sticker said, this is feminist theory on a bumper sticker. The feminist bumper sticker said, every woman is a working woman.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. And of course, that was challenging this terrible, at least in English and maybe in other languages too, this terrible phrase, working women, as if a working woman is only a woman who's paid for her work. And this bumper sticker, every woman is a working woman, says there's work, some of it is unpaid, and a lot of it is paid. And women are doing both. And this pandemic has opened up our understanding, if we're willing to understand it. Depends whether you've got any feminist curiosity about economics and about public health. Our understanding that women's unpaid labor, especially childcare, elder care, holding families together under enormous stress of shutdowns and job losses, that women's unpaid labor is crucial to entire countries and to international economics. Mm-hmm. Will we continue to learn that? Will we support women's unpaid labor? Or when everyone's gotten their double vaccination and they've returned to this fantasy land called normal? Will everyone forget the lesson they learned and go back to imagining that their mothers and their grandmothers and their aunts will do all the unpaid childcare?
Yeah, and I think, I mean, the statistics show that the majority of jobs that were lost in the US due to COVID were lost by women. So that like is a great
That's a
example.
double whammy.
Yeah, yeah, and also some of the women do have to do two jobs, work their own job at home and then do childcare and education as well, right? If you have to use Zoom to educate your kids, so I think that's another level of like.
Yeah, and I would say it's unethical international finance.
Mhm.
Unethical international finance to simply assume that women will always do the unpaid labor, and then you'll go and make your, not you, but this mythical international finance officer at a bank or an investment company, the finance ministry of a country, that it's unethical to imagine that they can just build their models for economic recovery without giving a thought to women doing unpaid labor. And that's pretty common.
Yeah, definitely. And thank you for bringing that point to the conversation. And of course, feminist thinking could inform us about the inequality under COVID. We see that people of color are the most affected, right, due to existing inequality. So it just amplified inequality that feminist scholarship have highlighted, right, has highlighted before along racial class, race, class, and gender as well.
Yeah, I mean, I think that this is I have a very broad definition of ethics, but I think it's unethical to take for granted racism.
Mm-hmm.
Take for granted means you have no responsibility for challenging it. I think it's unethical to go about whatever one's work is and take for granted sexism and misogyny and just say that has nothing to do with me. I have my little narrow professional groove that I'm in, and let somebody else worry about violence against women. Let somebody else worry about women disproportionately being affected by the pandemic. That kind of dismissal, that kind of narrow groove professional thinking really leads to unethical behavior, I think.
Mm-hmm. And I don't know, I mean, if you saw the news of the shootings that happened.
I did, in Atlanta.
Was it 6 Asian women that were killed?
Well, it's 8 people were killed. You and I are having this conversation just as the investigation is going on. It looks as though it was a single man who did the shooting, a 21-year-old man who they've now arrested. We'll find out if that's true, but that seems to be true. Out of the 8 people who were killed, they were killed if it's true that he is the lone shooter, he shot people at 3 different work sites. And the majority of the people he shot, but not all, were Asian American women working at those work sites in Atlanta.
Mm-hmm. And, just to highlight, I mean, again, it's still early on in developing, so we don't have all the information, but it kind of highlighted also the rate of hate crimes against Asian Americans after COVID and the rhetoric that was used to kind of, tie COVID to certain
to Asian groups, and particularly East Asian groups. And that kind of cavalier assertion that this terrible public health crisis was brought on somehow by Asians, that is an unethical assertion, especially if the person who makes the assertion or the person who repeats it. It's not only the person who makes the original unethical assertion, dangerous assertion, but it's the people who repeat it. Mm-hmm. And what they're doing is they are inciting hateful behavior towards a group of people, and that's unethical. So it's not just the original person who made that dangerously invalid claim. It's anybody who repeated it on social media or in a public space or to somebody else.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Cynthia. And now I move us on to another topic. I have been curious about cybersecurity. I taught a class on cybersecurity. I presented a paper at the International Feminist Journal of Politics conference on cybersecurity. So I've noticed a gap, and I'm still in early stages of doing research, that there are only a few feminist analyses of the digital space beyond, violence against, kind of sexual assault and violence against women in the cyber realm. But I noticed that the majority of people who are thinking about cybersecurity are either related to the defense, military, or kind of entities sponsored by government. Or there's realism, thinking like defensive and offensive capabilities in the cyber realm, even though it is a heavily populated space, like civilian populated space, right? And I look at the Israeli-Palestine context in terms of digital colonialism. So I was wondering, I don't know if you thought about this, but if you did, or if you have any thoughts on how can we apply feminist ethics to emerging challenges that we're facing, in the cyber digital space.
Well, I think this is true. I mean, now, Anwar, you're the specialist here. I'm way outside your realm. But here's what we've learned over the years. Well, the cyberspace sounds so new to many of us, and a lot of us don't feel very comfortable with the technology. I mean, we all use it, but I mean, really being able to think deeply about forms of hacking and so on. But here's what we do know. We do know that in the history of technology, and this is just a new technology, in the history of technology, the introduction of the railroad, the introduction of certain kinds of tools, in the introduction of technology, there's always gender dynamics. Mm-hmm. Who was thought to be most likely to lose their respectability if they rode a bicycle? Boys? No. Women. The bicycle was very, very controversial for girls and women to ride. So was the sewing machine, I learned. There was a big debate in France in the 1800s about whether it was proper for women to use a pedal sewing machine. A lot of this is sexualized, of course. But here's the real point. I don't mean that cyber technology is the same as the sewing machine. But here's the thing we do need to learn. If every technology that has been introduced over decades and even centuries was either loosens the binaries between what's a real man and what's a real woman, what's a respectable man and what's a respectable, it either loosens them, makes them more porous, or it reinforces it. And I think what we found from a lot of people like yourself who are using feminist curiosities to chart, you have to watch it, you know this, you have to watch it over time and in very specific spaces, and you're watching it in the space that isn't gaming, but is national security, right? You always have to ask, is this strengthening masculine privilege, particularly of some men? Is it reducing gender inequality? You always have to ask it. Every single new technology. We're about to have more and more electric cars. That's going to be good for the environment. What will happen to women's relationship to electric cars and men's relationship to electric cars? Will it be exactly the same or not? I mean, we don't know, but you better ask ethically. Anytime you're involved in either the development of a new technology or the assessing of it or the marketing of it or the distribution of it, to be ethically on top of it, you better right then and there say, is there anything about the way this technology is being marketed, the way this technology is being designed, that will increase inequality or lessen it? And if you don't ask that question, then you become complicit in unethical technological professions.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that's a great point. I'm going to take these questions and try to apply them to the paper I'm starting to think about, because it definitely seems like it does reproduce inequality in like whatever.
It doesn't have to. That's the thing. And that's what's going to be so interesting about your finding. It doesn't have to. That is, gender is not embedded in the pencil.
Yeah.
Or in the sewing machine. It's how people imagine who will be best at it, who should make the most money from it, who will be the most skilled in using it. Mm-hmm. There's nothing, the plow is a perfect example. Plow, as you know, plows are so important all over the world. And in most societies, it is imagined that only men are good at plowing. Now, there's nothing that says that women aren't good at plowing, but that was a huge technological breakthrough in the history of the planet, of humankind, the introduction of the plow. That's a major technological breakthrough. And how did the plow get so deeply embedded in masculinity that it gave men who are already advantaged in agriculture an even greater leap towards privilege?
Mm-hmm. Yes, thank you, Cynthia. And I know that you have to go soon, so I want to thank you again for agreeing to have this conversation with me. I know I learn a lot always by talking to you, and it's great to kind of engage in intellectual or feminist curiosity with you about important issues for feminist thought in international politics, and also considering ethics in politics internationally and domestically. I want to thank our listeners as well, and I hope you guys enjoyed it as much as I did. Cynthia, I hope that you enjoyed the conversation as much as I did. That's it. I really hope we see you again.
That was Cynthia Enloe being interviewed by Anwar Mhajne. It was recorded on March 17th, 2021. Stay healthy and safe.